Narcissism is not about loving yourself too much. That is the misconception that makes it so easy to miss. The person who dominates every room, who cannot tolerate a single correction, who needs to be the most admired presence wherever they go, they are not overflowing with self-love. They are terrified. The grandiosity is not confidence. It is a structure built to keep something much more fragile from ever being seen. Most of us learn about narcissism the wrong way. We picture someone vain, someone loud, someone who posts too much and apologizes too little. And while those things can be true, they describe the surface. They tell you what narcissism looks like, not what it actually is. What keeps me returning to this topic is that the psychological reality is almost the opposite of what popular culture suggests. The grandiose self-image that defines narcissistic behavior is not the core of the personality. It is the cover story. Beneath it sits something that clinicians consistently describe as brittle, shame-prone, and desperately dependent on external approval. There is a phrase associated with Kierkegaard, the idea that the deepest despair is not being who you are, and it captures something real about this. The narcissistic person has, in many ways, built an entire identity around not being who they fear they are. The performance is not confidence. It is avoidance. If you have ever tried to offer honest feedback to someone like this and watched the room catch fire, you have already seen the thing underneath. What you triggered was not arrogance. It was exposure. And once you understand that, the behavior stops being mystifying. It starts to make a painful kind of sense. People with fragile self-esteem do not just bruise when criticized. They erupt. And for a long time, that seemed paradoxical. If someone truly believed they were exceptional, why would a single critical remark destabilize them so completely? Roy Baumeister and Brad Bushman studied this directly, looking at threatened egotism and aggression. What they found was that the most hostile reactions to criticism came not from people with low self-esteem, and not from people with genuinely secure self-esteem, but from people in between, those who scored high on grandiosity, but whose self-image was unstable. The aggression was not the product of confidence. It was the product of a self-image that required constant defense. This distinction is the key to understanding the whole pattern. Secure self-esteem is quiet. It does not need applause to stay standing. Narcissistic self-esteem, by contrast, is what researchers call contingent. It depends on a steady supply of admiration, and it can collapse the moment that supply is interrupted. This is why the emotional range can seem so extreme. Praise feels like oxygen. Criticism feels like annihilation. The inner life swings between feeling uniquely special and feeling worthless, sometimes within the same conversation. Heinz Kohut, writing in The Analysis of the Self in 1971, introduced the concept of the grandiose self as a developmental structure. All children need a version of it early on. But when the environment fails to respond with appropriate mirroring and warmth, that structure becomes frozen. It does not soften into mature confidence the way it should. The adult narcissist is, in part, still performing for an audience that was never quite there. Picture someone who has just been passed over for a promotion. Most people feel disappointed, maybe envious, perhaps quietly motivated to try again. For someone with a deeply narcissistic structure, the same event carries a completely different charge. It does not register as a setback. It registers as a verdict, as confirmation of something they have spent enormous energy trying not to believe about themselves. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, wrote about the human need to feel that one's existence carries genuine weight. The narcissistic solution to that need is not authentic. It is defensive. The self that gets presented to the world is not the real self-seeking connection and validation. It is an edited self, a curated self, built to preempt the shame that the real self seems to guarantee. This is what makes narcissistic behavior so difficult to confront. When you challenge the performance, you are not simply disagreeing with someone. You are threatening the architecture that keeps a much older wound from opening. The reaction you get, the rage, the contempt, the swift counterattack, is not disproportionate to their experience. It is entirely proportionate to what is actually at stake for them. James Hollis, in Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, described this pattern as the psyche projecting strength to protect what is most vulnerable. That framing has stayed with me. The mask is not vanity. It is armor, And armor, by definition, means something underneath needed protecting. Understanding this does not excuse what the armor does to people nearby, but it does change the nature of what you are dealing with. Understanding why someone behaves this way does not mean you are required to absorb the behavior. Compassion and limits are not opposites. That distinction is worth sitting with. If you are close to someone who fits this pattern, a few things from the research are worth knowing. Direct confrontation of the self-image almost never works. It triggers the exact defensive response that closes dialogue down entirely. What sometimes creates movement is consistent, non-reactive feedback, not attacking the mask, but also not pretending the mask is the whole person. Second, the grandiosity is not who they are. It is what they built. That distinction may not change your situation, but it can change how much of the contempt you carry personally. The dismissal directed at you is rarely really about you. It is about the part of themselves they cannot look at. Kahner, Men, in Thinking Fast and Slow, described how the mind constructs coherent narratives to shield its self-image from contradictory evidence. In narcissism, that story building is not subtle. The entire personality becomes organized around keeping the alternative narrative, the shameful one, out of conscious view. And the third thing, perhaps the most honest, some people are not ready to examine what is underneath. Growth in this area requires a willingness to sit with shame that has, for decades, been turned outward. That is genuinely hard work. Not everyone chooses it, at least not yet. What this really means is that the most defended people are often the most frightened. That is not an excuse, but it is a map. And having a clearer map of how another person's inner world is built might be the only thing that lets you move through it without losing yourself in the process. If that kind of map is useful to you, the psychology underneath behavior that gets written off as simply difficult, this channel keeps building it, one concept at a time.